Good evening, and welcome to another episode of Tales from the Darkness. Gather round and try to stay in the light. Some of the others from the dark aren't quite as civil as I am, and I hate cleaning up that mess. Vengeful Porcelain Doll from Anonymous. I just felt the urge to share this paranormal experience, so here goes. It was a typical Friday night for me, and that included going to my church for these weekly Friday night Bible studies with the youth group. Now, at the time, I was a moderate skeptic about the paranormal. I was curious, but never really took it to heart, and I think that's a healthy stance to have about most things. Anyways, my church rented out the space for these meetings from another church, and we shared the building. Because of this, my friends and I would often explore, going into different rooms and just playing around like kids do in high school. Well, one day my friend, we'll call him Joey, ended up in a room and we decided to explore the cabinets a bit because there were a lot of cabinets. Rifling through them, Joey discovered a baby porcelain doll dressed up in a baseball costume. He showed it to me and tried to spook me with it, but I just laughed it off. The strange thing about this doll, however, was the bluish hue to its skin, as if it had choked and its mouth was twisted in a way that was unnatural. It was slightly unsettling, but I thought it was kind of funny. As a joke, my friend and I started playing catch with the doll, going over cabinets and doing trick shots, when, on impulse, he threw the doll against the wall. Obviously, this caused the doll to break into a bunch of pieces, and I was mortified. Not so much because the doll was broken, but because it obviously belonged to the other church. We panicked a little and started picking up the pieces, when I picked up a rather large piece and discovered, to my surprise and delight, that the entire face of the doll had somehow managed to stay intact. I picked it up and scared my friend with it, and he obviously tried to play it off. I was happy because now I had something to scare other people with, so I went around to other people in the church and scared them with it. However, when I tried scaring my mom, she warned me that the doll face gave her some really bad feelings, like a heaviness. In hindsight, I should have listened because my mom has a pretty good spiritual intuition about things, whether you are a spiritual person or not. Fast forward to me going back home with this porcelain doll face in a Ziploc bag, intent on showing my friends at school this monstrosity, disregarding my mom's disapproval. I decided to sleep with it on my bedside table and went to sleep. The next morning, I woke up and the room was spinning, and there were black dots in my vision. I called out for my mom, who came in and checked my forehead, only to find it burning hot. She checked my temperature and started freaking out because it read 104 degrees Fahrenheit, and demanded I give her the doll face, saying that she knew it must have been because of the doll. At this point, I was having auditory hallucinations as well as visual ones. But to describe it to you, there were black hands clawing the ceiling, and I could hear a child's laughter in the most creepy way possible. But for some reason, I was strangely reluctant to trash the doll, and argued with my mom for a while before the exhaustion and delirium caught up with me, and I gave up. She took the doll and drove it to the other side of the neighborhood to dispose of it, and when she came back, to her and my surprise, my fever was already slowly falling, and I was beginning to feel a lot better. To this day, however, skeptic that I am of the paranormal, when it comes to my mum and spiritual things, I always take her advice now, because that was just a little too coincidental for comfort. Things that go bump in the coal mine, from Ballistic Habit. I spent nearly a decade underground. The work was hard and dangerous, but could be rewarding and very well compensated. Coal mining is a way of life here. Entire families have worked the mines. I myself have several family members who have retired or work down there still. I got out. Not because of these experiences, but because I believe coal mining will end soon. There are other reasons, but I don't want to identify myself. Now, I'm no superstitious backwoods hillbilly who attributed every little thing as paranormal. I have a science and engineering background. Most things have reasonable explanations for the things we see. These stories of mine, or those that were told to me, are not the case. They have no explanation. The first time I heard of anything going bump in the dark was relayed by a coworker. I was still a redhead at the time. For those who don't know, for the first 6 months to a year, depending on state law, a new miner must wear a red hard hat. They cannot leave sight or sound of the black hat they are assigned to. I was working with a guy about my age who was a no-nonsense guy when it came to work. He was an extremely competent coal miner. We were working with a bolting machine when I looked over at the rib, or the wall, and clearly written on the rib support was the word ghost, followed by the time and date, which was a few weeks prior. Curious, I asked about the writing. He gave me a sheepish look and relayed this story to me. I was working down here off by myself, running the bolter. It was nearing the end of the shift, and I was keeping an eye for the relief crew to arrive on section. I just happened to look across the bolter and see a man standing there looking at me. I was just about to say something when I realized that this guy was certainly not on our crew. Then I realized his cap light was emitting no light, and was in fact an old carbide lamp, not our battery-powered ones. My adrenaline spiked, and all I wanted to do was run away, but I was rooted to the spot, looking at him. He was about 5 feet away, standing behind the bolting machine, so just visible from the chest area up. Just as I was about to open my mouth to speak or scream, I'm not sure, he turned 90 degrees and began walking along the side of the bolter. What is even stranger is, with every step he took, he would sink lower and lower into the ground until his head was below the edge of the bolting machine. Picture the stairway gag if you know what I mean. I snapped out of it and ran around to the other side of the machine. I see no one there. He was gone. Seemingly sank into the earth with each step. In a daze, I walked to the track and saw the relief man trip had not arrived. It was just our crew. I wrote the time and date on the support to help recall where and when I saw this. I returned to that spot many times hoping to see him again. I never did. My first encounter was just after I had gotten my black hat, allowing me free access to the entire mine. I was still wet behind the ears, however, and given a job that was essentially a babysitting gig. Go me. The job entailed watching over a machine called the booster drive. It was a machine that was placed along the belt that transported the coal out of the mine on a longwall section. Its whole job was to keep the belt moving and the river of coal moving out of the mine to the process facility. It's usually a cake gig if the beltmen did their job correctly. I shovel up any spilled coal and call in the cavalry if crap goes sideways. Now, unlike 95% of the rest of the mine, the booster drives had lighting installed. The light would spill up the entryway only so far, however. Beyond that point, it was the same inky black nothingness I've described before. I'd been there for a few days already and kept catching movement out of the corners of my eye. I grew up shooting and hunting, so unnatural movement catches my attention pretty rapidly. It would always disappear when I tried to look directly at it. Thing is, I would feel frightened, and definitely threatened when I would catch fleeting glances of it. It felt ominous. One day, after a pretty active day of jerking my head at the blackness and seeing movement always retreating into the dark, I got angry and foolish. I called out, "I see you!" Whatever it was took 2 full strides into the light. It was shaped like a man, same size, height, and shape, only it was completely black. A complete absence of light, but it had dimension, a thickness, full and thick like a man. I was so scared I got tunnel vision, and it seemed like all of the machinery went silent. I know it didn't because the belts were still chugging away. It stood there for about 5 full seconds, did an about face, and walked away into the dark. I stood staring at that spot for a good 20 seconds afterwards until my vision cleared and the steady roar of the booster filled my ears again. My head stayed on a swivel the rest of the shift. When I was relieved, I asked the man who took my place on the next shift, "You ever see anything moving around down here?" He took a long look at me and replied, "Yes." I asked, "What the hell is it?" He said, "I'm not sure I want to know." I wish I could say I never saw it again. That thing scared the crap out of me. This thing creates intense feelings of doom. Whether it emits this intense emotion, or it is a natural reaction to such an unnatural thing, I don't know. This story concerns another encounter with this awful thing. I was working the same supposed cakewalk gig at the same booster location. This thing was discussed between the man I relieved, myself, and the man who relieved me. We were all generally terrified of it. Some days we would notice it hanging around, just out of the light, making 10-hour shifts seem like an eternity of looking over our shoulders. Other days, it would be completely absent. The days it was absent weren't exactly the best either. It was almost as bad wondering where that damn thing was than actually seeing it out there pacing, flitting about, or worse, just watching us in our peripheral vision in the bare edge of the light. This shift I was on started like any usual. I attempted to mentally prep myself for another day of shoveling spilled coal while having the crap scared out of me for the next 10 or so hours. After riding the man trip into the booster, I spoke to the stressed out, scared man I was relieving. I told him about the weather topside as we were expecting snow by the time he got outside. He told me it had been a quiet day and he hadn't seen any glimpses of our shadowy visitor. We talked for a bit while he waited for the man trip that would be his ride out of the mine. Eventually it arrived and he wished me luck while I told him to have a safe drive home. I was watching the belts cruise along, transporting all the black rock out of the mine, when suddenly all of the power kicks off. My work area was instantly plunged into the pitch blackness and the dull roar of the machinery coasted to a stop. The sudden change from bright light and noise to quiet blackness was unnerving. I turned on my cap light and made my way to the power center that controls the juice to check if the power kicked locally or if it was more widespread across the mine. I found all my breakers still set, meaning the outage was more than my booster. I got on my radio and confirmed the situation with the power was mine-wide. I made a seat with some bags of rock dust and leaned against the airlock wall to settle in for a bit. It was at this point I heard it. Footsteps. There were footsteps walking toward me. But no one was there. I was hoping upon hope I would not see that black human-shaped mass out there in the dark. They were heavy footfalls, like the sound of a huge man in work boots. This was bad enough hearing someone walking around near me in the dark that I couldn't see, but sometimes the footsteps would increase from a slow walk to a run, to a sprint, to footsteps so rapid no human could possibly make them. I felt like I was losing my sanity. I cannot possibly describe how incredibly frightened I was. Suddenly, the lights and power kicked on without warning. It was standing 10 feet away from me. I screamed at it to leave me alone, and it turned around and walked away into the darkness. I damn near passed out from the shock and fear of it. If I hadn't been sitting on those dust bags, I'm convinced my knees would have buckled from under me. Once I had calmed down some, I realized I actually pissed myself a little. Embarrassing to admit, I know. If I hadn't urinated so recently, I have no doubt I would have soaked my trousers. The Old Woman, from Anonymous. This happened to me and my fiancé about a year ago. We live in Pennsylvania, but had to be in New York for a party, so we decided to stay at his mother's house in Jersey rather than spend money on a hotel. It would give his mom a chance to see our children and spend time with her for a few days. I love his mother, so it didn't bother me one bit. She lives in a 55 and over community, so all her neighbors are around their 70s. My mother-in-law is the youngest on her block. Well, as nightfall hit, me and my fiancé tucked our children into bed and spent the remainder of the night watching movies on the couch in the living room. It was quiet. Not much went on, until we heard a noise that came from the guest bedroom where our girls were sleeping. I just assumed they were up, so I went to go check on them. As I got up, I get this ringing in my ears, as if someone is with me. I shrug it off and check on the girls. They're fast asleep. I figured one of them woke up from a bad dream, but just fell back asleep. I make my way into the living room and sit next to my fiancé. A few minutes go by and it's quiet again. Then, all of a sudden, we hear a loud thud coming from their room. We look at each other again, assuming that the kids were awake. My fiancé walks in and sees nothing. The girls are still sleeping. He comes in and says it was nothing, that maybe one of them fell out of the bed and climbed back in. We laugh, but then we hear the doorknob. The living room is next to the bedrooms, so you would hear it very clearly. We were expecting one of them to come walking out, but nothing. We look at each other and get the chills. It was weird. A few minutes pass and still nothing. So I get up again and they're sleeping. I sit on the couch trying to chase the feeling that something isn't right. We then lower the TV volume to hear something now coming from the kitchen. We listen close. We hear footsteps. Not that of a child, so we figured that we missed his mom walk out of her room. But when he calls out to her, nothing. We look at each other and start to get freaked out. Then, as we're looking at the hallway in the kitchen, we see the pantry door open. Very slightly, but it did. I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, so I didn't say anything. Then, all of a sudden, a woman with a white robe runs from the kitchen to the bathroom. I shrieked. My fiancé was in disbelief. We looked at each other frozen. He says, "Go check it out." I look at him like, "Hell no, you're the man, you go look." That was not his mother. We sat there for a few minutes, just trying to contemplate what happened. My 3-year-old then comes out of the room. We jumped. She said she was scared and wanted to sit with us. We allowed it because we were scared too. She tells us that the lady woke her up, but before we get a chance to ask her what she looked like, she fell asleep. The next day, my mother-in-law said that she heard me scream and asked if I was all right. I told her what had happened, but she laughed it off and said that she's never had an experience. My fiancé forgot about the incident, or maybe he didn't, and he just didn't want to seem crazy. But he told me it was a dream. I'm 100% sure it wasn't a dream. My mother-in-law started to tell me that the woman who lived here before had died in the house. I felt terrible, because in her last days, she was alone. Maybe this spirit just wanted to have fun. Who knows? What I do know is that this wasn't my last experience in that house. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe if you want to hear more. Don't forget you can now listen to these episodes on Spotify, link in the description down below. If you would like to have your story narrated, you can send it to storiesofdarkness55@gmail.com. And as always, pleasant dreams.